21st, and then on February 26th are Alfredo Yar and Robert Trafford. So before I introduce Rodriguez, I wanted to say a couple more things about this exhibition and really encourage everyone to make it to Portland for those of you who can. It's a project that stems from the racial justice protests in 2020 and the tremendous amount of police violence that those protests were met with. And the exhibition itself really looks at Portland's history of policing from a variety of perspectives, from the perspectives of racial, environmental, juvenile, and spatial justice. And it includes 3 substantial local commissions, one from Don't Shoot Portland, a local racial justice advocacy organization, the Black Aesthetic Studio, which includes a variety of members, including 3 former Design for Spatial Justice Fellows in the Architecture School, Cleo Davis, Kane Talton Davis, and Robert Clark, along with Kimberly Moreland, the president of the Oregon Black Pioneers. And then also Michael Bernard Stevenson and Blue, 2 artists based in Portland. And so those are the local commissions. And then we have 3 wonderful loans in this, or collection of works that form the loans, including a wonderful body of work by Sandy Rodriguez, which I'll talk more about in a second, as well as a piece by Alfredo Yar and a few pieces by Carrie Mae Weems. And then one of the additional highlights of this exhibition is an investigation into the use of tear gas in Portland during the 2020 protests by the British research and arts organization Forensic Architecture. And so please come and check out the exhibition. There's also a variety of programming associated with it. It opens on February 23rd and runs until May 19th. We have an opening night celebration, which includes a walkthrough of the exhibition on February 23rd. On the 24th, there is an artist panel discussion, which Sandy Rodriguez will also be a part of, so come up to Portland for that. And then we have another highlight is a symposium on March 8th and 9th that really looks critically at both the history of policing and what has happened really since 2020 in the city of Portland. We're all here today. It's my great pleasure to introduce the first of our speakers, and that is LA-based Chicana artist Sandy Rodriguez. I learned about Rodriguez's work a few years ago while I was in LA at the Getty, and I was absolutely blown away by an installation at LACMA that I saw, and I've been a super fan ever since. And I'm so delighted that she's able to contribute both to the exhibition as well as be here today to speak to all of you. Rodriguez's work has been widely exhibited in group and solo exhibitions across the country, including a solo exhibition that's still on now for a few more weeks called Sandy Rodriguez, Unfolding Histories, 200 Years of Resistance, at the Art, Design, and Architecture Museum at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her work is also in a number of important collections across the country. Just some highlights include the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Huntington, the Amon Carter Museum of Art, the Denver Art Museum, and the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. She's won numerous awards for her work, including the most recent awards being in 2023, the Jacob Lawrence Award from the American Academy of Arts and the 2023 Hermitage Greenfield Prize. Rodriguez's work is deeply rooted in research, history, materiality, and place, and I think it's especially exciting for those reasons to have her in the university setting. She's become particularly well known for her practice of anti-colonial map-making of the Americas with large-scale works that look back to pre-Columbian cartography. But rather than telling stories of imperial conquests, these maps serve as testimonies of resistance that speak to human rights concerns of today. And in her lecture, she'll talk about her ongoing series, Codex Rodriguez-Mondragon, along with a body of work focused on tear gas, a subject that she's been working on since 2014, and which is actually featured in the exhibition in Portland at PICA. So without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Sandy. And if we could adjust the lights, please.
All right. Now can you hear me better? Oh, you're so welcome. So I was saying thank you so much for having me. And so over the past 7 years, I've been working on a series called the Codex Rodriguez-Mondragon. And this series maps resistance to ongoing cycles of violence on communities of color by blending historic and recent events. The maps are made with hand-processed mineral and organic pigments and sources, including insects, plants, and minerals. So this is working with watercolor using a 16th century Mexican colonial recipes to make the paint. You can see some of the sources on the lower part of the screen. All of this work is painted on amate paper, which is a sacred ceremonial paper of the Americas. So the codices of the Americas are traditionally painted on this sacred ceremonial, once outlawed paper. At the time of the Spanish invasion, the libraries are burned and there are only a handful of codices, visual narratives, on this amate paper that exists today. So it makes absolute sense to create this series of resistance on outlaw paper. So it's really about recovering the medicinal and aesthetic uses of local plants and pigments that allow for the work to support healing and awareness building of historic and contemporary trauma. So it's really a vigorous kind of field study, historical and ethnobotanical kind of approach that's very interdisciplinary in terms of my research. And it has the urgency of addressing human rights crisis in the United States and the US-Mexico border. So what you're looking at is the first map. A year and a half of field study and research went into creating this map that you're seeing in front of you, which is Mapa de la Región Fronteriza de Alta y Baja Califas. So every bioregion within the state of California is painted in colorants that I sourced in those places while doing this field study. It includes images on color processing inspired by the Florentine Codex, which is a 16th century text. And it also includes razor wire all throughout it, indicating the sites of human detention for immigrants. So there's this way in which time and space are layered upon one another to create these objects. So as I said, field study is an important part of my process, and so I will go out camping off-grid with no Wi-Fi, no running water, and I will camp in various locations. While it started in California, it's now spread to 12 states across the United States. So it involves taking my sketchbooks and my amate paper and my pigments out into the field and doing studies of nature and slowing down, really. So we have a little less than an hour, but really I'm going to be sharing with you the ways in which research informs my practice, including these colonial Mexican codices, recent scholarship, data collected from contemporary news sources, and field study to learn about these ecosystems and communities. So my archives are both contemporary and historic. It consists of color, plants, minerals, knowledge systems, and relationships with scholars that I consult with in a variety of disciplines, artists, and elders. One of my goals is to disrupt European dominant narratives in museums with paintings that interrogate legacies of colonial aggression. I'm committed to create these visual narratives, installations, and exhibitions that provide opportunities for audiences to engage with histories that allow us to see how we've arrived at this contemporary moment. I'm motivated by the horror of the news, by creating visions of a better future, and by bearing witness through testimonio. I spent almost 20 years working in museums and working really with Western European and encyclopedic museum collections. 14 of those were spent at the J. Paul Getty Museum. So I had a chance to really teach and learn about methods and materials of painting. I am 3 generations of a Mexican painter, but what my background in teaching in museums was really about the Western European tradition. So it was at the time when I was able to transition out of my full-time work as a museum educator into full-time studio artist that I was able to really conduct the in-depth research about the history of image making and colors of the Americas. It was at that point that I ran across the research of Diana Magaloni and a small text called Colors of the New World that I really took a deep dive into understanding the primary source of the Florentine Codex. Book 11, which tells of the natural world, and there's a small section over there. So it's 2,000 pages, it's 12 books, but there are some fascinating passages around medicinal plants, the history of color, and a number of subjects. So at the same time that I'm doing the field study, I'm taking very close attention to edible, medicinal, utilitarian plants of each region, and then cross-referencing that with herbals and botanicals from the moment of contact from 500 years ago. And so the culmination was the map that we just looked at. So here you'll see some images of me in the Great Basin Desert, in the Sonoran Desert. And so you'll see while I'm standing above what's a very hot river in these geothermal hot pools, where I met this stinging nettle plant, and then you see how it manifests within the painted map. Here on the other side, I'm camped out in the Sonoran Desert, and you can see the variety of the landscape, and then you'll see the vignette. So just giving you a sense of what those isolated moments out in the field and how they manifest within the overall work. One of my happy places is in Arizona. That is a canyon that has some of the most extraordinary endemic plants. It's very close to the US-Mexico border, and I went into this canyon about 4 times, but each time there was massive shower storms that started, and you don't want to get stuck in the Slot Canyon with those kinds of storms coming through. But you'll find gallons of water that people leave for migrants. You'll find clothes, all kinds of details that unless you go out and you spend the time in the field, you don't think of. But this is just north of Nogales, so Nogales. There's a lot of twin sister cities. So I'll go out and I'll make these small amate postcards, and I'll come back and have decks of these small studies that I'll place around the studio to try to understand which ones are going to make it into the painting. So here you see them all laid out on a hotel bed, because it was about 110 degrees by the time I got to El Paso, Texas. So there was that one time that I was like, okay, we're going indoors. And then I'll cross-reference that with the University of Michigan's ethnobotany database. This is a book that's about 900 pages that tells you the traditional uses of plants from all across North America. And so you can look up any number of plants that are endemic or that are specific to your region and understand the ways in which people have related to this plant over time. So because I'm studying native plants, the ways in which I was introduced to them is through their common English name. But what were they called before that? And so then you get introduced to them through their Latin binomial. And what were they called before that? Can we learn the names of the plants as they have been addressed for thousands of years? So you'll see that in the first ones, because I'm really looking back to the Florentine Codex, the names are included in Nahuatl and in English and in their Latin binomial. And you'll see the ways in which the elements of the Calavera copter come in and out of the paper. One of the things that's important to note about the botanicals is that originally I had envisioned them as kind of line drawings that I would print in a folio set, and I would hand color them with their own colorants. But guess what? Plants don't yield the color that they are. So it became something else. And this one is painted in a Maya green with the cochinilla, which is that red scale, or that red that comes from a scale insect from that cactus. And so when you go out into the field and you study these plants, you see them at different moments. Sometimes in the spring with the blooms, sometimes later in the fall with the fruit. We were looking earlier at a botanical in your collection, and there's the sacred datura I was talking about, tolache. And this is a medicinal plant that's used for ceremonial uses. And so as I'm working in different regions, it's important to understand whose land you're on. And so the names then change into the Cahuilla original name, then the English, then the Latin, then the Spanish common name, to demonstrate knowledge over time and relationships with plant communities. When I'm in Joshua Tree and I spend quite a bit of time out there working at a foundation, but what was it called before Joshua Tree? That's not its name, right? And so I learn, the different names and I include it on the captions below. But Hamwichawa, el árbol de Josué, Yucca brevifolia. And so these will start as small studies, and now there's a 8-foot one of these. So I want to get to the actual size plant portraits. These are 2 more that are from the show that's on view at Santa Barbara. And so for these, I had to go learn the Chumash names. And within the Chumash community, there's 5 different variations. And so really consulting with people who are working on the language dictionaries, it's important to get the vetted name by contemporary people who are working on it, as opposed to just continually reproducing information that's 30 years outdated, right? And so this is a yerba santa, which has saved me 1,000,000 times. It's an incredibly potent medicinal plant for upper respiratory. And over the past 4 years, every time I get the sniffles or start thinking that I might have the Rona, I'll have some tea of this and it clears you right up. And so one of the things that became really exciting for me was studying the first materia medica of the Americas that's called the Cruz Bariano. And it's this tiny little book. It's like 4 by 6 inches with a red velvet cover that's in a vault in the Museo de Antropología in Mexico City. It had been in the Vatican before it was rediscovered for several hundred years. And then it gets repatriated to Mexico. And it has some of the most extraordinary recipes in there. And so this is 1552, and it has recipes for a number of things. What you're looking at is a visual recipe. So I basically had to take this Latin text that was translated from Nahuatl to Latin with 2 stylized pictures of plants. I had to work with an early modern person to get some Latin translation, because this is 16th century Latin written by a Nahuatl physician. So once I get all the ingredients kind of ID'd, mostly, there's 2 that I still don't know, I created a visual recipe for it. And so this is for healing susto, or trauma, or fright. And I think after the 4 years that we've witnessed, we could all use a little remedio for susto. The text is dedicated to remedies for ailments such as stupidity, goaty armpits, government officials experiencing fatigue, to physical ailments like toothache, fever, body pains. And it has those culturally specific emotional symptoms like trauma, fright. And the survivors of the 1521 conquest and subsequent epidemics, in turn, the Cocotzli outbreak and the mumps outbreak of 1550, witnessed so much suffering that this is part of that recipe book. And while we can never truly understand the experiences of people who endured that colonial aggression firsthand over generations, we can look at primary sources like this Codex Rodriguez-Mondragon and the Florentine to see how traces of these ailments were treated in the past. We can read news stories and listen to testimonials about families experiencing the ongoing colonial aggression in our present day and the dehumanization of migrant communities by federal policy. So it's by means of research, writing, and art making that the traumas of the past and the present can be put into context. So my talk is really going to focus on a selection from the Codex Rodriguez-Mondragon. There's 15 maps over the past 7 years and dozens of these plant folios that we're going to look at. This particular one is Mapa of the Child Detention Centers, Family Separations, and Other Atrocities. These are 8 feet by 4 feet. Wherever you see a landscape is where I have gone and rested my head on the ground and camped under the stars, woken up and fallen asleep with bird songs. So this is at the height of the family separations policy of 2018. And each of the colorants that you see are color-coded based on materials that I've picked up. One thing that I want to draw your attention to is the changing borders on this map. And so this is really inspired by the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So you can see those boundaries and those border markers, or boundary markers, I should say. Each state has a border tinted with a light range of hand-processed historic colors. The yellow is from a mushroom. The red is from cochinilla. Ochre is a mineral. Maya blue is indigo with a palygorskite clay that is fused. Palo tinto is interior bark that can be processed into 4 colors. And Maya green. The map is drawn in walnut ink, which is that beautiful brown walnut ink. And I'm using the feather of an owl, birds, that I fashioned into a pen. So the marks will only exist in this particular work from a feather that I found on a hiking trail. So it's about really doing that field study in Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico. And I spent 5 to 7 days driving to these remote areas, carefully observing, smelling, sketching, tasting, touching native plants from diverse floristic communities to create those decks of postcards that I showed you earlier. Here you'll see a detail, and you'll see the source. So that book, the Florentine Codex I was telling you about, has this image of weeping mothers. And whereas before, when I was doing this research, I had to use the Library of Congress version that was digital and like flip through hundreds and hundreds of pages. Now there's a digital Florentine Codex that you can search by subject, and it is fantastic. So I paired the image of the weeping mothers from the historic source to the border near the tent city in Tornillo, Texas, where hundreds and hundreds of migrant children are being held in triple-digit temperatures in these really inhumane cages. And you see a figure of a child on the floor with an emergency blanket. Here's another detail where, again, I've taken a scene from the Florentine Codex and I've really kind of introduced it into this particular scene in Texas. And this comes from a news story where a young father, had hung himself because he didn't know when he was going to be reunited with his son. So I physically separated the families in the map and included the figure of the father kind of dissolving. The small blue boat that's on the bottom is an image that's inspired from a historic film. There was something called Operation Wetback in the 1950s, where US-born and Mexican-born Latinos were rounded up, caged, shipped on trains to the Texas coast, and then put on boats to Veracruz, whether or not they were from Mexico or not. And families were jumping from these boats. And so this again calls to mind just kind of cycles of when we see immigration policies. Here's that view from the Sandia Mountains in New Mexico. There's that great horned owl. And it's standing right next to some western antler lichen. Lichen is extraordinary. You have tons of it over the ground over here. Ethically, you can't collect it from the tree because it's doing a very important job of creating oxygen, but you can pick it up from the floor. And there was a recipe that I learned from a paleobotanist for processing lichen. And she kept finding this lichen in various vessels in the museum collections that she worked in, and didn't understand why they had so many remnants of this lichen in these vessels. And it wasn't till later that, after doing research, she discovered that it's used for embalming, it's used for perfume, it's used to make dye, it's used for medicine. So it has a lot of different applications. And when you're boiling plants to make color, it doesn't always smell so good. But this particular lichen smells like heaven. It smells like perfume. It's amazing. And there it is. And I'll tell you, I sometimes will just read for the information that I need. And so you basically have to boil it and do a heat extraction, and then you agitate it every night and put it back under the sink. And it takes 22 days to get this pink color from it. And I'm reading. I'm like, okay, it's 21 days. Here's my color. And then I continued to read, and it said, Oh, this only works on cellulose, or this only works on proteins. So feathers or wool or silk. And I'm working on cellulose, so it's like disappearing ink by the time I get to use it. But not every experiment's going to be successful, but that's kind of half the fun of your studios, your laboratory, and you're playing with color extraction. Sometimes I read a headline. And in 2018, I read the headline, "She died of dehydration and shock," in an NPR story about the death of Jacqueline Calmaquin, a 7-year-old Guatemalan girl who died in Customs Border Enforcement custody. The story shook me. I put it on a sheet of amate paper and I taped it to the wall in the studio. It was just too horrible to process. I couldn't do it. I had to go out and do field study for a number of months. And I flew into Arizona, rented a car, drove 1,000 miles to El Paso and back, sleeping under the stars, hiking the mountains, the canyons, getting harassed by Customs Border Enforcement. Came home with dozens of studies, and I dug deeper into the English press and the Spanish press, into local news services, to really understand what had happened to these 7 migrant children. I learned as much as I could. I visited a zoological collection to understand the color of a quetzal feather. These were difficult stories to tell, and to tell them in a way that's respectful, that honors the lives of these kids and these families. And 7 of these kids are Guatemalan, and so that's where you see the quetzal on the lower corner of the painting. The quetzal also dies when in captivity. It's also the national bird. It's on the flag. It's a way of locating kind of this, these stories. And sometimes you're using the work of community-based organizations that are advocating for justice. And one thing that I should say about this is that I worked with Diana Magaloni and gave her all the news stories, and she crafted these beautiful poems in English and Spanish that accompanied these portraits in the exhibition space, and then performed them as part of the program with a group of poets that I worked with. And this is the big map that plots those locations of those 7 child migrants. The white orbs are where each one took their last breath, and you'll see the details that I've included in this particular map. Several of these portraits will be on view in a couple weeks at the Cantor Museum at Stanford. These are 3 images of healers that I included as part of that exhibition. And so I took healers from the Florentine Codex, their gesture, their posture, their clothing. And the first one is for the treatment of respiratory illness on children. But I took the face of various scholars I'd been working with and replaced the faces of the historic image with contemporary portraiture. So these will also be on view at Stanford. So that's Dr. Diana Magaloni, Dr. Nandi Aponte Cohen, and then Dr. Ella Diaz, who I've been working with on this series over the years. And I put a little self-portrait of myself with the one with Ella. One of the children, I included a double portrait of Yasmin and her mother, and then included this plant from the Cruz Badiano for pain of the heart. And so again, you're just seeing the ways in which I take contemporary and historic sources and really layer them to create a new kind of narrative. So we're fast forwarding to 2020 and the first weekend of protests, and this is a small painting that I created for an exhibition that was on view in Texas. And my exhibition schedule is pretty robust, and there's always something in the queue, but by the time I got home from one of my trips, I decided that I was going to take this small study and blow it up to an 8-foot map. And I was just doing this for me. No one had asked for it yet. No one even knew it existed. one of the first maps that I created in 2018 around police aggression is this particular view. And so you see this map, Mapa de Los Angeles, for those who have been killed by police in 2018. This was a commission by the city of Los Angeles at the Municipal Art Gallery. And I said, well, if the city of Los Angeles wants to commission a piece for me, I'm going to show you kind of part of the history of our city that people don't want to talk about. And so we installed it underneath these series of Calavera copters, which are skull face helicopters. We have more helicopters in LA than most industrialized nations. And I included 2 plants on each side, one for the east and one for the west. I worked with the LA Times database on every person who's been killed by police in Los Angeles County, and their stories are told on this website. So you can click on each one of those names and get information about what happened, and like love notes from their friends and loved ones and the photo of them. And so you understand which neighbors of yours have been killed by police in public. So this is what the map looks like in a closer view, and so you see all the dots. And those are the locations, but they're also marked with several layers of cochinilla. The yellow that you see on this map is pomegranate skin, the blue is Maya blue, again, that's that log wood and some walnut ink. But you can see some closer details. And the comet becomes an omen of, you know, terrible things happening. And then you have the little egrets that I see on my morning walk. I live near Venice Beach. And so on my morning walks, I see those egrets. So I had to include them in the map. I use a lot of historic library collections, and this is an image, a detail of a lynching that takes place in the 19th century in Los Angeles. And then there's our toyon, which is a potent medicinal. Some more views and details. There's a pomegranate that I was telling you about, an owl, also an omen of death, and then a little skull rack kind of referencing public executions. And those are the names for 2020. And it was in 2020 that I started working on the second map, this one, Mapa for Los Angeles 2020, for our neighbors killed by police amid these protests. And these were on view at the LA County Museum of Art for several months. And someone contacted me from Say Their Names LA and said, hey, you know, we saw the names of some of the members of our organizations, like family members. And so on Mother's Day, I did a walkthrough for the family members of several of these folks, and was able to, you know, share just kind of stories with them, and it was really powerful. But you're gonna see this flaming car on fire a few times. But this was one of the scenes from 2020 that really kind of made an impression upon me. There it is again. But this one is from also the same time period, and I'm working in isolation in Joshua Tree for about 4 months, and really just taking a look at some of the atrocities and the uprisings of 2020, 2021. And I've included various vignettes that are then outlined in the cartouche on top that have those kind of moments captured. So the bottom has a small view of these protesters that are holding signs for Carlos Ernesto Escobar Mejia, who was the first migrant to die in ICE custody, Immigration's Custom Border Enforcement. And then there's a small kind of view of the butcher bird that is on an agave that has these little mice and like rodents, lizards, kind of pierced on the tip of this agave. And then there's that police car on fire from mid-Fairfax in Los Angeles. And then there's a small detail of DHQ, which is a chemical agent that Customs Border Enforcement were spraying on migrants amid the pandemic first quarter and causing like respiratory damage to the point where people are coughing blood and they're not letting people outside. So there's a lot of bearing witness that goes into these maps that I try to layer with you know, elements from the natural world. There are 3 little scared owls on the top. that have, I wish I had a detail for you, but they have some very kind of animated expressions. So a lot of these are smaller studies that then make their way into some of the maps that you'll see. Oops. And here is one of those landscapes where I did the postcard study, and then like a 19th century travel journal, I wrote on the bottom what that experience was. And so I was in Nogales, and near that canyon I was telling you about, and I'm camped on the top of this hill, and it's beautiful, beautiful landscape. But Customs Border Enforcement are dragging chains on the roads every night because they want to see if migrant footprints are going to be visible. And so I'm camped on the top of this hill, and I'm in a rental car, and my friend has their own car, and we both have out-of-state plates. And then at 3 in the morning, I'm asleep in the back of this car because I'm not feeling safe, like camping outside. 2 border enforcement vehicles come screeching up to the passenger side with their headlights pointed out my window. I wake up, and all I can think to do is push the car alarm. And at this moment, I think I'm going to get dragged out of the car, but I text my friend and was like, dude, they're here. And no sooner did I text him, do they drive away just as fast as they rolled up. So it's about intimidation, and it's about just letting their presence be known. But so that story is written across the bottom. And I started adding 23-karat gold to the nighttime nocturne scenes and the stars. And I had to work really closely with a medievalist who did a lot of manuscript painting and gilding, water gilding on wood panel to figure out how to make the gold stick to the amate. Because this is a paper that is fibrous. This is bark paper. This paper is made out of exterior bark that is boiled, pounded, and laid to dry in the sun, but it has no sizing. So the way you work on it is a technique that I've had to develop over the past 7 years, but it is, it's alive. And if you have a chance to come up to Portland to see the show, you'll see kind of the power of this paper. This one is Rainbows, Grizzlies, and Snakes, Oh My, Conquest to Caging in Los Angeles. It is inspired both by the Florentine Codex and the frontispiece to Book 12, which is of the war, not the conquest, of the war, right? It's also really responding to the research of a historian, Kelly Lytle Hernandez. And so the title borrows from her book title. And so I'm trying to understand how Los Angeles becomes the carceral capital of the world. We have more people incarcerated in LA than any other place. And so I trace it back to the mission period, when people are captured and enslaved and put to work in the mission system. So you have a lot of these details that are really miniature on this 8 by 8 foot map. And now that takes us to the work that you'll see in Portland. So I had been working on this piece slowly over the past several years when I met Nina. And she told me about her exhibition. I said, well, did you know that I'm working on a tear gas map of the US? And so that's how our conversation started, what, 2 years ago? Yep. So it's taken me some time to really think about this particular map and how it was going to be different. So hopefully over the past 40 minutes, you've seen how each map is different and very distinct to where I'm at with this series and this body of work. So you'll see these small details from scenes that were inspired by a news story from the New York Times, where they had 100 cities across the US where protesters were tear gassed. So this is a detail of Minneapolis. Here's the cartouche, which is inspired by historic maps. And my Calavera copters that keep appearing throughout the series of work. Here's a detail of Philadelphia. And a lot of times I'll be watching a video and I'll have to do screenshots. And this is a particularly difficult clip to watch, as you know, there's a protester whose arms are already bound behind her back in handcuffs. And the officer goes up and pulls down the mask and sprays her in the face. And you know, it's only now that we're starting to see some of those cases being tried and what those results are. Here's the detail of Portland. And the protester kicking the gas at his feet. A detail of Southern California. This is like US-Mexico border. And so I kind of had them seated on the border. And this is a puffer fish that is just in shock of what is happening. So I try to include these kind of like little surprises for you as you get closer and look at some of these details. Little iguana. I have a residency that's taking me to South Florida every few months, and it's just covered in iguanas. So I had to put my little iguana there. And so there's 3 medium-size kind of landscapes or tear gas paintings. And so this one has that day when the leaf blower kind of enters into the strategies for protecting themselves in these kinds of moments. And so on the bottom of each painting, you have like the day that it takes place and the location. And so these are painted in a charcoal. I have a lot of fires when I'm out in the desert. I collect all the charcoal, I grind it up, it's sparkly and beautiful and chunky, make it into paint, and then I'll create the background with it. But because these are about poisonous gas and chemical agents, I start to use some poisonous colors like cobalts and cadmiums to give that sharp contrast from the organic, non-toxic colorants to the modern period that we're living in. Here you have an isolated, almost abstracted scene, which is just this archway. And the goal of these is to really kind of get the viewer from a distance to get a little closer and to examine these particular works of art. And so it's going to be very exciting to see how this series of works are going to be kind of contextualized within the exhibition. And so that small vignette that you saw on the large map then becomes a large painting. And so I found out, I found Mauricio Jose Sanchez on Instagram, and I emailed him, because he's the one that took the photo that inspired this painting. And so I've layered a few sources in this work, but I got to, you know, just have a little text message exchange with him. And he actually won the Pulitzer for this particular photograph while shooting here during the protests for as long as he was. And so those are the Calavera copters that are kinetic light sculptures. So the one that you'll see on view as part of the exhibition, I think is 10 feet by 12 feet. It's massive. But when light hits it, it creates all these shadows around you. And so it's kind of giving you that kind of under surveillance feeling that you have, or I have so frequently in Los Angeles. But so these are like some smaller ones. And as you heard earlier, I've been working on tear gas paintings since 2015. So I wanted to show you some of the earlier ones before I started in Amate. I was an oil painter. I still paint in oil sometimes. So this is an exhibition at Art and Practice, which is in Los Angeles. And so you see a whole installation of these nocturnes and tear gas paintings from various protests that had occurred that year. This one is from Baltimore. And so here I've taken out the figures and really just included those really toxic colorants to kind of create these atmospheric, almost abstractions from the tear gas paintings. And then the flood of lights. This one's from Ferguson. And these are, you know, 36 by 48 inches, but really kind of leaning into those really cancer-causing colorants and giving you that kind of experience of seeing this kind of view. And it's funny, I didn't really realize that it was at this point I start drawing on top of the canvas. And so these are black grounds, but you see the same techniques that are happening on the amate now. So it's interesting where you start to quote yourself either in subject and or handling of the material. Here's another one from Ferguson. This is one that's done a little bit later, and this is tear gas and water cannons from North Dakota when the water protectors were getting blasted in the freezing cold on Thanksgiving. There it is, water cannons. And they were getting pounded with the lights that would not let them sleep at night. It was something that I really needed to put to canvas so that we don't forget. Because as news stories kind of cycle, these are things that just kind of flash past. And so here's just a few views of the Calavera copters that I've been working with since 2000. So it was 2000, and there was a 3 strikes law that was happening in California. And that's when the LAPD copters got the skull faces, and I started making little Calavera copter mobiles. And those were layered with big kind of manifest destiny American art style views of the many prisons in Los Angeles. But they had the heroic light, and so these hanging over them, and so that's how it started. 24 years ago. And so this is the scale of the one that you're going to have. And those are pronosticos. So in the Florentine Codex, when they talk about the invasion of the